John had always considered himself an ordinary guy, a mechanic, living on Earth, working on machines most of the time, and keeping to himself. He never expected his life to change. That was until the day he was assigned a special job to repair a ship that had crashed on a distant planet, Cylon 4. It wasn't the kind of place John had imagined. The planet was strange, filled with bizarre alien creatures and a vibrant market full of exotic goods. But what really struck him was the sky. It was purple, a color that seemed unreal to him, almost dreamlike. He couldn't help but feel like he had stepped into another world, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. He'd only been on Cylon 4 for a few hours, but he was already trying to adjust. He followed the coordinates given to him by his supervisor and made his way to the bustling marketplace. The crowd was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Aliens from different parts of the galaxy walked around him, trading goods and chatting in languages that sounded foreign but strangely familiar. The air was thick with the scent of strange spices and the hum of energy running through the city. As he wandered through the crowded streets, John felt out of place. He didn't understand the alien language or their customs, but he wasn't here for sightseeing. He was here to do his job. The ship he was supposed to fix was just a few blocks away, and that was where his mind was. Then, as he walked past a set of market stalls, something unexpected happened. He brushed against someone. Not just anyone, though. Her. John's eyes widened as he looked up and saw a figure who could only be described as otherworldly. A woman, but not just any woman. Her features were unlike anything John had ever seen. Her skin was a soft, shimmering shade of blue, and her eyes glowed faintly with a golden hue. She wore a long robe made from a fabric that seemed to shift and change colors with every movement. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. She was stunning. John had been so lost in the moment that he didn't realize his hand had touched her arm. At first, it was just a gentle brush, a mere accident. But as soon as their skin made contact, something strange happened. There was a sudden jolt of energy, something electric, that ran through John's entire body. He recoiled, stepping back quickly. He blinked, confused, trying to understand what had just occurred. The woman's expression changed immediately. Her eyes widened, and she looked at him with a mix of shock and something else, something darker. She took a step back, her body tense, and John could feel the sudden tension in the air. She hadn't said a word yet, but John could tell that something was wrong. And then she spoke. "You don't know what you've done," she said, her voice trembling slightly. John stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. "What? I didn't mean to." "You've broken the law," she cut him off, her voice sharp. Her tone was firm, almost commanding, but there was also an undertone of fear in it. "You've touched me, and that's not something that can just be undone." John was utterly confused. He had touched someone by accident, and now she was acting like he had committed some grave crime. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He didn't even know what law she was talking about. The woman's golden eyes glinted with a strange intensity. She seemed to be calculating something, sizing him up, and John felt an overwhelming urge to turn and walk away. But something inside him stopped him. The touch had felt like it was more than just a simple accident. It felt important. "I'm sorry," John stammered, finally finding his voice. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." Before he could finish, she grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who appeared so delicate. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It's already done." John felt a chill run down his spine. What was going on? What had he done? The woman's expression softened for a brief second, and then she quickly turned her gaze away, her mind clearly racing. "This is complicated," she muttered to herself, barely loud enough for him to hear. John couldn't help but feel both frightened and drawn to her at the same time. There was something about her, something about the way she held herself, that made him want to understand what was happening, but he also felt out of his depth. "Who are you?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the crowd around them, then back to him. "I'm Lyra," she finally said, "and you are now bound to me. By law." John felt his stomach tighten. "Bound to you? What does that mean? I don't even know you." Lyra's gaze hardened. "You will," she said, her voice low and serious. "You will learn more than you ever wanted to know, and you will wish you never touched me." Before John could say another word, she pulled him toward a hidden alleyway, away from the bustling market. The crowd seemed to part around them, unaware of the strange exchange taking place. John followed her, both confused and scared, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. What had he gotten himself into? And what exactly did she mean by bound to her? The last thing he wanted was to be stuck in some alien marriage, but the way Lyra spoke made it seem like there was no way out. Lyra pulled John deeper into the alley, her grip still tight around his wrist. The moment they stepped away from the market, the noise of the bustling crowds seemed to vanish, leaving only the heavy silence between them. John's mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything. He had touched her. That was it. But now, apparently, he was bound to her by some ancient law, and she wasn't exactly making it clear what that meant. His pulse was racing, his thoughts scattered. He had no idea what was happening. As they reached a small, dimly lit room at the end of the alley, Lyra stopped and turned to face him. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of urgency and something darker. Fear, perhaps, or regret. She released his wrist, but stepped closer, her presence somehow overwhelming in the confined space. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking slightly, as if she was trying to hold herself together. "This isn't just a simple mistake. You've touched me in a way that changes everything." John looked at her, still lost. "I didn't mean to. What is this? What do you mean, changes everything?" Lyra took a deep breath and lowered her gaze. When she spoke again, her words were heavy, filled with the weight of an undeniable truth. "Where I come from, when a human and an alien of royal blood touch, it creates a bond that's impossible to break. You and I, we are now mates." John's heart skipped a beat. "Mates," he repeated, the word foreign on his tongue. He couldn't wrap his head around it. He wasn't from this world. He wasn't part of any royal family, and certainly he hadn't signed up for some kind of cosmic bond. But the way she said it, so sure of herself, made it sound like this wasn't a choice. It was something bigger than both of them. Lyra's eyes lifted to meet his again, and for the first time, John saw a flicker of vulnerability in her expression. "I didn't want this," she whispered, almost to herself. "But it's the law. And now we're connected in a way neither of us can undo. And there are people, many people who will try to separate us, who will try to hurt us." The weight of her words hit him. His stomach twisted, and his thoughts spiraled. How had he ended up here? One minute, he was just a mechanic doing a job. And the next, he was bound to an alien princess by some ancient, unbreakable law. What kind of mess had he gotten himself into? "What happens now?" John asked, his voice low and unsure. Lyra's expression hardened. "Now we have to protect ourselves. From them. From anyone who learns what's happened. Because the moment they know, this will be a war. People will want to control the bond, to use it for their own gain. And that's something I can't let happen. Not to me. Not to you." John's mind was reeling. A war. He wasn't a soldier, and he had no idea how to fight in some intergalactic power struggle. And yet, here he was, at the center of something that felt much larger than he could ever imagine. "Why me?" he asked, almost to himself. "Why a human?" Lyra stepped closer, her voice quieter now. "It's the law. It's always been the way it is. Humans are different, stronger in some ways, unpredictable. The bond formed between us is more than just a mating connection. It's an alliance, a union that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy." She paused, as if the words weighed her down. You may not understand now, but you will. I didn't ask for this either, but we are tied together, whether we like it or not." John shook his head, trying to clear the confusion. His life had just turned upside down, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. But Lyra's words were clear. They were connected now, and they weren't just bound by some random law. They were part of something bigger, something that could get them both killed. Lyra stepped back, her eyes scanning the alley. "I'll explain everything to you, but we have to move quickly. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it becomes. There are people who will come for us. They won't stop until they've taken what they want. We can't wait around for them to find us. We need to leave. Now." John hesitated, his mind racing, but there was no time to argue. Whatever was happening, he had no choice but to follow Lyra. The bond had been made, and now, whether he liked it or not, he was in this for the long haul. He just didn't know yet how deep the rabbit hole went. Lyra gave him one last look, a mix of regret and determination in her eyes, before she turned and walked out of the small room. John followed her into the unknown, unsure of what awaited them, but certain of one thing: his life was never going to be the same again. The air outside the room felt colder, and the streets of Xylon 4 were now a maze of shadows, with tall, looming structures casting dark shapes against the flickering lights. John had barely enough time to process what had just happened before Lyra pulled him along, moving quickly through the labyrinth of alien architecture. He could feel the weight of her urgency pressing against him. As they turned a corner, Lyra's grip tightened on his arm. "We're being followed," she whispered, her voice tense. John's heart skipped a beat. Followed? By who? Lyra didn't answer immediately, instead glancing around nervously. Her movements were sharp, her body language alert, as if every corner held danger. It wasn't until they reached a narrow alley, far away from the crowded marketplace, that she spoke again. "By them," she muttered, her eyes darting toward the dark street ahead. "They know what happened. They'll come for us soon." John felt a knot form in his stomach. The thought of being hunted by unknown enemies was terrifying. But something in Lyra's posture told him she wasn't just scared, she was prepared. "What's going on, Lyra?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Who's coming for us? Why?" She hesitated before responding. "The laws of our kind aren't simple," she began, glancing around again, clearly wary of being overheard. "When a human and an alien princess are bound, it's more than just a bond. It's a symbol, a declaration of power. And that symbol attracts attention, dangerous attention. There are factions, both within my people and beyond, who will do whatever it takes to control that power." John's mind was racing. "So this bond, it's a big deal." Lyra nodded sharply. "Bigger than you can imagine. The moment you touched me, you became a target. To some, you're a hero, an ally to be sought. But to others, you're a threat, someone who can upend the entire balance of power in the galaxy." John's head was spinning. He had no idea what he was caught up in, but he could feel the danger growing, a tightening grip around him that he couldn't escape. Wait, John said, trying to make sense of it all. You said I was bound to you. Does that mean we're, like, married or something?" Lyra gave him a look, almost amused, but it was fleeting. "Not exactly," she replied. "But yes, in the eyes of the law, you and I are now partners. It's a sacred bond. And as strange as it sounds to you, there's no backing out of it. Once it's formed, it can't be broken unless one of us dies." John's eyes widened. "Die?" Lyra's face tightened. "Yes, and if that happens, it'll set off a chain of events that could tear both our worlds apart." John swallowed hard. This was beyond anything he could have ever imagined. He wasn't just a mechanic from Earth anymore. He was part of something much larger, something dangerous. And the reality of that hit him like a freight train. His life wasn't his own anymore. He was bound to this alien princess, and every decision from here on out could lead to either their survival or destruction. Suddenly, a loud noise shattered the tense silence. A metallic clang echoed through the alley as figures emerged from the shadows, moving swiftly toward them. John's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea who these people were, but by the look on Lyra's face, they weren't friendly. "Stay close," Lyra muttered, pulling him behind a nearby crate. "And don't make a sound." John's breath caught in his throat as he crouched behind the crate with her. Through the gaps in the shadows, he could see the figures clearly now. Tall, armored beings, their faces hidden behind dark helmets. They moved with precision, scanning the area as if they knew exactly where they were going. "They're hunters," Lyra whispered, "sent by one of the factions. They'll take me back if they can, but they won't hesitate to kill you if they think you're in the way." John's mind raced. He had never been in a situation like this. He had no training for this kind of life or death scenario. Yet in that moment, he realized he didn't have much of a choice. He was already in too deep. Lyra turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Listen to me. I'll try to distract them. When I do, you need to run. You need to get to the ship I told you about. You can't stay here." John shook his head, a fierce feeling of protectiveness suddenly rising inside him. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not leaving you behind." Lyra gave him a hard look, her golden eyes intense. "If you don't leave, you'll die. We both will." But John wasn't hearing it. He wasn't going to abandon her now, not after everything they had been through. He couldn't. Something inside him had already changed. The bond between them was undeniable, and he couldn't walk away from it, no matter the cost. Before Lyra could respond, the hunters moved closer. It was too late to argue. John's mind raced, and his body tensed. They were surrounded, and there was only one thing left to do: fight or run. Either way, he was about to find out just how far he would go to protect Lyra and to survive. The hunters were almost upon them, their footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness of the alley. John's heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. He could hear Lyra's breath beside him, steady but tense, as her eyes darted between him and the advancing figures. The armored figures moved with cold precision, their black suits gleaming under the flickering streetlights. They weren't just here for Lyra. They were here for the bond, the power it represented. They were here because of him. He was no longer just a man from Earth. He was a part of something much larger, something that these people were willing to kill for. Lyra's hand shot out, grabbing John's wrist with a fierce grip. Her voice was low and urgent. "When I give the signal, run. Don't hesitate. Do you understand?" John nodded, his mouth dry. He didn't know what was going to happen, but he trusted her. He had to. She looked him in the eyes, her expression softening for a brief moment. "Stay alive, human," she whispered, before turning her gaze back to the approaching hunters. John could barely breathe. There was so much he didn't know, but the one thing he did know now was that he wasn't going to let these people take her. He couldn't. Not when she'd already become a part of his world, whether he liked it or not. The hunters stopped at the entrance of the alley, their weapons raised, scanning every inch for movement. They didn't need to look long. One of them raised a hand, signaling to the others to fan out. The quiet hum of their weapons charging up filled the air, a sound that sent chills down John's spine. Lyra's eyes flicked to the side. Her signal. Without another word, she darted forward, moving faster than John could comprehend. Her speed was almost inhuman, but it didn't surprise him anymore. She had the strength of her people, and she was using it to protect them both. She jumped into the fray, her movements a blur as she incapacitated the first hunter with a quick strike to the chest. The man went down with a thud, his armor cracking under the impact. The second hunter fired, but Lyra was already out of the way, ducking behind a metal crate and using it as cover. John didn't need any more convincing. He didn't wait for a second invitation. He turned and ran, His legs carried him faster than he thought possible, adrenaline surging through him. As he bolted through the alleyway, he didn't look back. He knew the only way out was to keep moving, to follow Lyra's lead. The sound of blaster fire rang out behind him, but he didn't stop. His thoughts were a whirlwind, his breath ragged as he rounded another corner. The alley twisted, leading him into a narrow passage that opened up to a wider street. In the distance, he could see the sleek ship Lyra had mentioned, a vessel small enough to blend in, but fast enough to escape if they needed to. His heart hammered as he made his way toward it, but the moment he got closer, his instincts screamed that something was wrong. There was no sign of Lyra. The ship was open, but the area around it was eerily silent. "Lyra," he called out, his voice cracking with desperation. No answer. A sickening feeling settled in his stomach. He had to find her, no matter what it took. The idea of her being out there, surrounded by those hunters, filled him with panic. But before he could take another step, a shadow flickered from the corner of his eye. Lyra appeared from the side, her movements smooth and calculated. She had taken out the last of the hunters, but her expression was grim. She wiped the blood from her blade, her eyes scanning the area for any more threats. "They're not gone," she said, her voice low but filled with authority. "We need to leave now. There's no more time." John nodded quickly, swallowing the fear that rose in his throat. He had no idea how many more were out there, or who exactly was behind this attack, but he could see in Lyra's eyes that they weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. He rushed to the ship's controls and punched in the activation sequence. The ship hummed to life, its engines kicking in, and the low rumble beneath them made it clear they were ready to take off. But as they climbed aboard, someone, stepped out from the shadows. John froze. A tall figure in dark robes, completely cloaked except for a pair of piercing eyes that shone with an otherworldly glow, stood before them. The air seemed to thicken, a strange pressure building around them. The figure didn't move, but John could feel the weight of its presence. Lyra's face hardened. "You," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. "You're the one who's been sending them after me." The figure stepped forward, its voice deep and cold. "You think you can just run from me, Lyra?" it asked. "You have no idea what you've started. And now it's too late." The tension in the air was thick. John could barely breathe, let alone speak, but Lyra was unfazed. She stepped in front of him, her posture straight and unyielding. "Whatever you think you can do, I won't let you take him. I won't let you destroy everything." Her voice was steady, but there was a fire in her words. "We're leaving, and no one is stopping us." The figure laughed, the sound sending a chill down John's spine. "We'll see about that." In an instant, the figure raised a hand, and a force slammed into John's chest. He was thrown back against the side of the ship, the air knocked from his lungs. He gasped for breath, his vision blurring as he struggled to stay conscious. Lyra moved with lightning speed, pulling him to his feet just in time to push him toward the ship. "Get in. Now," she ordered. John didn't need another command. He scrambled into the ship, his body shaking from the force of the attack. Lyra followed closely behind, her eyes locked on the figure, her hand already gripping the controls. With a roar of the engines, the ship shot into the sky, leaving the dark figure and the shadow of danger behind them. For now. But as they broke through the atmosphere, John knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As the ship soared through the vast emptiness of space, the heavy weight of silence pressed against John. His breath was shallow, his hands still trembling from the violent encounter. Lyra sat at the controls, her expression tight but focused, as the distant stars streaked past them. The ship hummed beneath them, its engine a steady reminder that they were safe for the moment. But John knew that this brief respite wouldn't last long. Whatever Lyra had gotten herself, and him, into, it was far from over. The voice of the cloaked figure echoed in his mind. It's too late. What did that mean? And who exactly were these people, these factions, that wanted to control them? John finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Who was that? What was that back there? Lyra didn't look at him immediately, her fingers hovering over the ship's controls. I don't know his name, but I know what he is. He's a member of the Zoroth, an ancient order who serves under the Emperor of the Dark Suns. They've been trying to control my people for centuries. John's brow furrowed. So, he's not just a rogue. He's connected to your government. Lyra nodded sharply. Yes, he's an enforcer. His job is to keep me, us, in check. But now that we're bonded, things have changed. He's not the only one coming for us. There are others. The moment that bond was formed, we made an enemy of the Dark Suns. John exhaled sharply, trying to digest the weight of her words. He had no idea how deep this went, how tangled he was in whatever war or politics Lyra was a part of. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't leave her. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the bond she spoke of, or maybe it was the undeniable pull of something deeper. He didn't know. But one thing was clear. Lyra was right. They weren't safe. Not by a long shot. As the ship pushed forward into the black abyss of space, the starlight outside flickered as if the universe itself was warning them. Lyra finally glanced over at him, her eyes meeting his. Her face was unreadable, but there was something in her gaze, something like determination and vulnerability all at once. I'm sorry, she said softly, for dragging you into this. I didn't want this for you. John shook his head, his voice steady despite the chaos that had unfolded. You didn't drag me into anything. I'm here because I want to be. Lyra's gaze softened, but she quickly turned back to the controls, her fingers pressing buttons with precision. You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what it means to be bonded to me, what it means for your life. John leaned forward, locking eyes with her again. I don't care what it means. I care about what happens next. I care about us. Her breath hitched for a moment, but then she nodded, accepting his words. We'll need to stay one step ahead, and we'll need to find allies. There's no way we can face this alone. John leaned back in his seat, his mind still reeling from the battle, from everything that had happened in such a short time. He had barely processed that his life had changed irrevocably, and now he was being told that enemies across the galaxy would hunt them down. Where do we go now? He asked, trying to anchor himself in the moment. What's the next step? Lyra turned the ship toward a cluster of stars, her eyes narrowing. We need to find a safe place, a place where we can plan, a place where the Zoroth can't reach us. There's an old colony on the edge of the Darwin expanse. It's hidden, away from prying eyes. That's where we'll start. John's thoughts raced, but he nodded. A hidden colony. That was as good a plan as any. But something tugged at him, a sense of dread he couldn't shake. What was it that the cloaked figure had meant when he said, "It's too late"? What was it that they were really after? John had no answers, but one thing was certain. They weren't just after Lyra. They were after something much bigger. And whatever that was, he was now caught in the middle of it. As the ship moved deeper into the darkness, John couldn't help but wonder if they would ever truly be safe. And even if they were, what kind of future awaited them when the universe itself seemed set against them? Lyra's words from earlier echoed in his mind. We made an enemy of the Dark Suns. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much danger they were in. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a battle for the very fate of the galaxy itself. And it was a battle they would have to face together.